Welcome, dear friends, to the next video in which we'll be discussing the topic of the psychological shadow. With this video, we will open up a new fourth section of our series, in which we will first talk about the shadow from a theoretical perspective. But don't worry, even today's theoretical explanation will be quite practically focused. First of all, I would just like to say that this is a series with connecting episodes. So if you are new to this channel, you might be surprised to see a purple ball in the person's body and some trees growing from it in this episode. For a full understanding, I would recommend watching at least the first episode of this series, in which I discuss the basics for today's episode. But let's get back to today's topic. In my opinion, the shadow and the related concepts of the conscious and the unconscious is the most important concept ever developed within psychology, and that's why I've prepared a more extensive video on it. And since I feel that the topic of the psychological shadow is very important, this main episode will be followed by 4 more sub-episodes, in which we will focus in detail on the development of the persona, the development of the shadow, analyze the overlooked concept of the collective unconscious, and present one typical example of the manifestation of the shadow in society. So if this topic captures your interest, you can look forward to further analysis within this topic on our channel. But first, let's start with today's main episode. The shadow is a theory and concept that was defined by Sigmund Freud and later by Carl Gustav Jung, and it's one of the major theories within analytical psychology. The basic impulse for the creation of this theory was belief of Freud and Jung that there is something that can be called conscious and the unconscious. And in our series, we will illustrate it like this. We place conscious in the front of the head and the unconscious in the back. It has a certain meaning, which we will explain later in the next chapter. And while the conscious, that is, what we are aware of, is automatically considered to be a natural human ability and is a certain domain in which we will find ourselves and which we consciously utilize, the unconscious, that is, by definition, what we are not aware of, is something that I believe has not been given enough attention in modern times. The unconscious was certainly already a subject of investigation in even earlier times. There is evidence of similar findings from far beyond our modern times, in India or in ancient Greece. However, my work on this topic is not an analysis of previous works. It is primarily the result of my own process. Everything I'll be telling you about this entire section of topics is based on my own experience, which, believe or not, I then spent about 2 years transforming into this resulting video. First, let's explain the important concepts, because the basic characteristic of the shadow is that it's contained in the unconscious. It's important to clarify what the unconscious, the conscious, and the shadow are. The unconscious is a broader term, and it includes all psychological aspects that are not conscious, that is, all those that we are not aware of. It may seem that if something is called the unconscious, it doesn't exist, or it's some area of something that acts passively, it's not important to us, and it has no impact on us. But this, of course, isn't true. The unconscious certainly exists, it's very important to us. And the unconscious aspects do not behave passively, unfortunately. The shadow can be seen as a particular aspect of the unconscious, but it's not equivalent to the unconscious. It's a particular specific aspect that acts as an independent element and has certain character traits, and it forms a complex intangible entity that has its own nature and its own dynamics that affects us. Next, let's describe the conscious a little. The conscious is the sum or the collection of everything in us that we are able to be aware of. This collection can include experiences, memories, opinions, attitudes, learned abilities and skills, and so on. It might occur to you that what we see and hear in our environment can also be included in our conscious, since we are able to become aware of it through our senses. But this isn't true. What we see, feel, or hear in our environment is really only experienced within ourselves. There are no external situations in the conscious. External situations travel to us through our senses, and only within us, in our inner conscious, do we then interpret them. And this is a very important realization. We then judge and interpret what we see in the outside world according to what is inside of us. Our consciousness, and especially our unconsciousness, determines how we see anything in the outside world. We will explain this a little more in the next chapters, but let's define a little more in detail what the shadow is. Like an actual physical shadow as a physical phenomenon, the psychological shadow occurs, figuratively speaking, behind the person. The term behind is used because we are usually unaware of it. That is, it stands behind the conscious. It's behind the person because it follows us wherever we go. And like the physical shadow, we are also able to become aware of or see the psychological shadow with some retrospection by looking back or behind us. The only fundamental difference between the physical shadow and the psychological shadow is the fact that we are able to move these unconscious shadow aspects from our unconscious into the conscious, or figuratively speaking, into the light. And this process, which is referred to as a shadow integration, is one of the most important processes in our spiritual growth. The similarity of the words conscious and unconscious shows us that the concepts and the meanings are closely related, and therefore a relationship definitely exists between them. If there is something in the unconscious and we can move it into the conscious, it will bring us a certain expansion of knowledge and enrichment. Conversely, if we place something conscious in the unconscious, for example, traumatic events from childhood because of their painfulness, or typically more primitive drives and instincts, we are losing something. And if we don't rediscover them, they will call attention to themselves, because they are something that was once a part of us, which we lost touch with. Of course, we subsequently have to be able to explain everything that we suppress, for whatever reason, either to ourselves or to those around us, because over the course of life, the aspect that is suppressed will demand attention, and it finds its way out often in the moments of inattention or a disturbed conscious. And so our personality is shaped in such a way that allows it to overshadow and explain its dark, inferior, primitive, and instinctive aspects. As we mentioned in the first video, it's these kinds of strong feelings that forms the dominant aspects of our personality. For the purposes of this topic, we will call these aspects of personality the persona, just like the Jung does. That is, the personality aspects arising from the impulses of the unconscious part of our existence. The persona can be seen as a mask that aims to draw attention away from the shadow. In order to balance and obscure the shadow aspects, it shows its opposite face. And of course, the stronger the shadow, the stronger the persona will have to be, for there is a great deal of energy hidden in the shadow, and, equivalently, a person is forced to put energy into shaping one's persona in order for it to have the capacity to suppress and obscure the nature of the shadow. And a person is forced to protect and preserve the strong persona, otherwise his shadow would threaten to surface. The person shapes his persona, and a lot of effort is put into this, and the whole process takes years, sometimes decades, without any awareness that something like this is happening. The result is often that a person completely identifies with his carefully constructed persona, we could say with his mask in public, or his role he plays in society. He is completely existentially identified with the fact that he has a name, a profession, and if he has to say anything else about himself, he will describe other aspects of his persona. He wouldn't even realize that he has a deeper essence, and that persona is just a mask he uses to make himself look better in public, so that these shadow aspects of him are not seen. To get a better idea of this, let's list two typical examples, where we will first describe the persona of such a person. Then we will try to clarify on the basis of which shadow aspects the persona was built. Let's start with the example that's most typical for this topic. In this case, the person is perfectly dressed, has sophisticated manners, appears intelligent, he studied etiquette, and he is careful about his moral profile, which he likes to present to the public. But this persona and all that it contains is just a mask to cover up certain suppressed aspects. In this case, it is formed for the sake of suppressing the more primitive aspects of its deeper essence. That is, for example, the basic human aspects of sexuality, or other aspects that we as human beings share with other animal species, for example. And since these more primitive aspects are very often suppressed by society because they aren't desirable in many situations, we try to suppress them in our development and start to build a persona that looks and gives the opposite impression in order to be acceptable to society. Another example would be a young boy whose self-esteem and self-worth is diminished by those around him. He feels within himself the desire to please his parents and gain their approval, respect, and love. And so he starts to pursue anything that would fill this gap in his self-perception. From the many areas of life, like relationships, sports, or art, he chooses an interest in technology and begins to pursue it while starting to suppress other desires and aspects of life. First, technology is often an ideal interest for such a person, because it's a safe discipline in which there is no threat of harmful feedback, which is always the case with other activities in direct interaction with people. And second, the unpleasant inner feelings that are inherent in this inferiority make a person want to do something about this situation. Everyone is looking for their self-worth, their self-esteem, and if they don't feel it in themselves, they try to supplement it in some way. So in this case, the person will start to devote himself to technology, and through this area, he seeks out his self-worth. Technology consumes his life because he can get the recognition and respect in this field that he so eagerly needs in order to fill in the hole in his perception of his own self-worth. In this case, then, the person will develop the persona of an expert technician, and he will devote a significant portion of his energy and interest to this field, because he would feel inferior in others. Both of these cases are very common, and we can use them to demonstrate the pitfalls of this whole process. The main and a real driving force behind the whole enterprise of technical person is not the love of technology, but the completion of the self-worth, in which interest in technology and the building of the technician's persona is only to serve as a tool. The first example shows us perfectly how the suppression of authenticity in ourselves, that is, the suppression of some of our natural aspects, can fundamentally shape our personality. Most important is the realization that whatever we suppress in our authenticity, in order to be accepted, we will never be able to remove, only suppress. And this suppression will influence us in the future. In the next chapter, we will see the result of this whole process. We've already discussed the concept of projection in previous episodes, and here in relation to the psychological shadow, it is even more typical. This is because we are usually more aware of painful topics within us than we are of the shadow. We try to hide our emotional wounds and traumas from others. We are afraid to open them up. We are ashamed of them. However, we are not aware of the shadow themes, which is understandable due to their very nature of being in the unconscious. We carefully profile our persona, often so perfectly that we are convinced of our own perfection. And we look for perfection in others. And if we don't find it, we can't handle it. And we begin to project our shadow onto others. We are not aware of it. It seems rather to us that the others are the problem, which we are usually more aware of in the case of emotional wounds or traumas. Let's explain psychological projection in a visual way. We already know from the first episode that from a spiritual point of view, we have a deeper and more superficial part. And since on that deeper level, we often feel imperfect, vulnerable, inferior, or are simply ashamed of some aspects, we try to build that more superficial part with which we try to cover up or compensate for those deeper problematic aspects. As we have already shown in several examples on this channel, we profile our personality or persona into the exact opposite nature of the one we are trying to suppress, precisely in order to cover up our unwanted version of ourselves. And here comes the first problem. We will never succeed in suppressing that unwanted version of ourselves. We will never expel it from ourselves. This version has its own story. Something was behind its development, and our task is to understand and heal it, not suppress it and pretend it does not exist. And so we have two versions of ourselves, and the more we suppress the problematic version within ourselves, the more it will unconsciously influence our behavior. That suppressed aspect of ourselves, now an unconscious aspect, will cause us to feel disgusted and revulsion if something reminds us of it in the outside world. And that is precisely the projection of the shadow, the projection of our shadow figure, the aspects that we have suppressed in ourselves at some point in the past. By projection, we divert attention from the inner world to the outer world, and find the culprit of our unpleasant inner feelings, the source of which are precisely those repressed deeper aspects in the outer world. And what about our constructed superficial part, our persona? We identify with it because it denies the problem at the deeper level. We are forced to build and protect this persona, and so we build a world around ourselves so that the repressed aspect is not found in it. We surround ourselves with what is closer to our persona, and we tend to constantly improve our persona. On the contrary, projection will not occur in a person who has not created their personality to cover up their imperfections, but does what they do from healthier motives. We can use the example of the expert technician to demonstrate such a projection. The projection of such a person will be his negative feelings and behavior towards people who are also technicians, for example, but are not as skilled in this discipline, or they are people who are involved in something else and they don't understand technology. Projection will only occur because the persona of the technician has been formed based on unhealthy motives. If a person is interested in technology out of pure interest and love for the field, he wouldn't experience negative feelings towards others. He would be happy with himself and with what he is doing. But our expert has built his persona on the basis of unhealthy motives and will certainly be incapable of realizing that the source of these negative feelings is his shadowy inferior character, containing all the suppressed aspects. If a person like this wanted to do something about these negative feelings, and to stop projecting his suppressed inferiority onto other people, he have to become aware of his shadow character and become aware of the whole process behind the creation of the expert technician persona. Otherwise, his tendencies to project onto other people will be inevitable, and they will get stronger and stronger over time, since, as we have already mentioned, the shadow becomes more dynamic in the unconscious. He will despise incompetent technicians, but he won't realize that he would be an equally incapable technician too if he didn't feel such a strong urge to excel in this field and thereby add to his self-worth. He will feel negative feelings towards athletes, for example, because sports represents marginalized area of his life, and the measure of value for him will only be knowledge and ability in technical disciplines. The projection of the perfectly dressed person will be negative feelings and behavior towards people who express themselves spontaneously, presenting their nature and authenticity on the level of feelings and expressions, and who do not look and act sufficiently noble and intelligent. Such a person will tend to gravitate towards people who also present themselves intelligently and look respectable. In turn, he will despise people who are located on a lower level in the socio-economical cultural world. This will be his projection, a projection of his own inner primitive, whom he has suppressed and whom, if he sees in the behavior of other people, he will hate. If he would like these feelings and manifestations to cease, such a person will have to admit to himself that the primitive people he sees in the outer world, those who so disturb him, are located within himself. They are located in his suppressed and more primitive and instinctive aspect, stored in the unconscious. He must then make contact with this aspect. He must make it conscious and become aware of all that he has been previously suppressed. Only in this way will it be possible for this person to experience inner peace. Thus, the psychological term projection is characterized by a shift of responsibility or blame onto others. It's therefore absolutely essential to take responsibility. It's a simple instruction at first glance, but believe me, try telling someone with a strong shadow that they should take responsibility for their emotional reactions to something they see in the outside world, that they found all their lives to be disturbing, distasteful, and totally unacceptable. Taking responsibility for one's own shadow issues can be no less challenging than working through severe trauma or healing deep emotional wounds. The difficulty of these issues is hard to compare or quantify. Strong wounds carry a great amount of pain, but the shadow brings a challenge in the form of its trickiness. The tricky thing about working with the shadow is that as long as the issue is unconscious, we are absolutely convinced that the problem is located outside of us, that someone else is to blame for our discomfort. And such a conviction can be so strong that a person becomes absolutely identified with it existentially and acts accordingly. So to sum this up, whatever we suppress in ourselves, whatever part of our integrity we repress, it will shift into the unconscious, and we will react with projection to whatever we see in the external world that reminds us these suppressed aspects and themes. By projection, we shift the responsibility for our own discomfort to the external object that activated our shadow, and in doing so, this act of projection fulfills its negative role, diverting attention from our own inner topic and throwing the responsibility for negative inner feelings onto outer object. Projection shows us that we have something in common with the object of our projection, that it's somehow related to us. The farmer shows the perfectly dressed man his suppressed natural and instinctive aspects. The under-intelligent athlete shows our expert technician the suppressed aspects and area of life. If we had nothing in common with the object of our projection, Such an object would evoke nothing in us. So let's take responsibility for our negative feelings and find out what is in our unconscious, because the projection of unconscious aspects has never brought anything good to the world. As we've become accustomed, we often use the term integration when dealing with psychological topics. And with the topic of the shadow, this term is even more relevant than with the previous topics we've dealt with on this channel. Integration of shadow issues essentially means moving the topic from the unconscious to the conscious, and by doing so, integrating it into our conscious spiritual being, thus making it part of us. It's integrated. We don't solve the issue, we don't decipher it like a riddle or an equation, we only bring it into the conscious. And by doing so, we allow it to transform. With topics that we see as traumas and wounds, the imaginary barrier is primarily pain and fear. For shadow topics and aspects, the insidious barrier is primarily unconsciousness. This is what we have to discover and go beyond. Integration of the shadow means that we start to become aware of the shadow issue. We stop projecting it onto others. We stop rejecting it and fighting it. By rejecting it, we are only moving the issue deeper into the unconscious and trying to suppress it. But, generally speaking, rejection and suppression is the best recipe for spiritual stagnation or degradation. On the contrary, if the shadow is correctly identified, the process of integration can continue successfully if we responsibly address and accept the topic as our own. Accepting the unconscious aspect is another crucial step. Once again, I will draw attention to the importance of the word acceptance. This doesn't necessarily mean agreement. We can accept a thing and therefore accept its existence, but at the same time disagree with it. This is a very important matter, because any issue that appears in the form of unpleasant feelings, fear, shame, or pain, acts that way because it wants to be heard and seen. The topic or aspect that is making itself known is not inherently demanding anything extreme from you. It wants you to accept its existence. It wants you to pay attention to it. And most importantly, it wants you to become a conscious part of you. It wants to be integrated into you. And you will benefit from it. You will be enriched. And this enrichment will be written into your soul and will never be taken away from you. I'm glad that you watched this episode all the way through, because the concept of the shadow, the conscious and the unconscious is a very important topic, and processing this topic was very challenging for me. I hope that I managed to shed some light on these psychological aspects for you, and I hope that it will help some of you in your own spiritual development. My analysis today, and I say this quite often, is really the result of my rather extensive research. Despite the fact that I greatly appreciate the work of Carl Gustav Jung in particular, everything I say today was created solely on basis of my own experience and observations. And so you can conclude that my analysis may differ quite a bit from the others. In any case, I would appreciate your feedback. You can write me in the comment section below this video. I will then focus on the most popular comments and will address them in the practical part of this episode. So in conclusion, if I had to highlight one important message within this topic, I would point out that the key to those negative feelings that arises from looking at something in the outside world lies within our own unconscious. We are our own worst enemy, but we only see the problem outside of ourselves. And if we don't want to remain in the role of a passive victim, we have no choice but to start exploring the possible causes of the negative feelings within ourselves. Because even after removing an external and irritating stimulus, your shadow won't leave you alone. It will find another object at which to aim its projective fire. Only through honest self-reflection and working on ourselves can we reverse the dynamic development of the shadow and become more of an observer than an active, unconscious participant in the madness full of projection on this planet. Many people would like to see change in the world, but few are willing to accomplish it within themselves. So I hope that this video will help some of you to do that. So my wish is that you put your heart, authenticity and strength into working on yourself. And by strength, I don't mean standing stubbornly behind your opinions, convincing everyone of your genius, the correctness of your views, and the perfection of your personality. By strength, I mean the opposite, going deeper into yourself, taking responsibility for your feelings and emotions, and to stop projecting them onto others. To find your dark sides and admit your own imperfections, because that's the only way we can become more perfect. I mean, more whole.